Hello, and welcome to this debate that's going to be occurring between two illustrious guests. We have in the one corner Mark Oppenheimer. He's a practicing advocate and member of the Johannesburg Bar. He's one of, if not the most important legal defenders of free speech in South Africa. You might know him through he and Jason Warblorf's outstanding philosophy podcast, Brain and Navat, which you all should watch. And then we also have Raja Halwani. He's a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and he is what some may say is the top leading philosopher regarding the philosophy of sex and love. And he's also published on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You should all read his work and his blog. It's very informative. We have a debate today, the motion of which is this House believes that Israel's war is unjust. So taking the affirmative position, we have Raja, and taking the opposition position, we have Mark. The debate is going to commence now. So, with his opening statement, we have Raja.
Thank you, Nathan and Stephen. Mark, I have only 10 minutes and I have a lot to say, so I'm going to read fast, so buckle up. So I will defend the motion that Israel's war is unjust, which I take is meant to refer to Israel's latest onslaught on Gaza. Given war's gravity, only profoundly serious threats can give us cause to fight, but because war is sometimes inevitable, various conditions have developed for a war to me to be just. These conditions are divided into at least two parts: conditions regarding the justness of the war, and conditions which apply to both launching and continuing a war, and conditions regarding the conduct of the war. My remarks focus mostly on the justness of the war, but I will say something brief at the end about the conduct. So the conditions of the justice of the war are the following. First, we have just cause, which is that the war attempts to avert or mend the right kind of injury, usually national defense or humanitarian intervention. The second condition is legitimate authority. The war is fought by an entity that has the authority to fight. The third condition is right intention, which is that the entity intends to achieve the just cause instead of using it as an excuse to achieve some other end other than the just cause. The fourth condition is reasonable prospects of success, so the war is sufficiently likely to achieve its aims. The fifth condition is proportionality, which is that the morally expected goods achieved by the war outweigh the morally expected bads that it will cause. And finally, one of the most important conditions is the last resort, which is basically states that there is no other less harmful way to achieve the just cause. So before starting, I have one misgiving about calling what is going on in Gaza a war that has to do with how to individuate a war. That is the lack of clarity as to whether this is a war or yet another round of fighting between Israel and the Palestinians. Because the last 100 years or so have been a continual state of war between Zionists who have sought to establish a predominantly Jewish state and continue to expand it at the expense of the lives and rights of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians who have resisted this establishment and expansion and have fought to protect their lives and restore their rights. Supporters of Palestinians are correct to claim that October 7th is another installment of a war that has been going on since, say, roughly November 2nd, 1917, when Britain promised parts of Palestine to become a home for the Jewish people. Since 2007, Israel has subjected Gaza to a blockade. Thomas Hobbes claims in Leviathan that a state of continuous war is not necessarily a state of continuous actual warfare, but a state of continuous hostility or enmity between the parties. Now, although there has been a general state of enmity between Palestinians and Israelis, blockading millions of people for 18 years counts as an active state of belligerence, not just a state of enmity. Moreover, viciously attacking Gaza in at least 5 military operations since 2002 also counts as a state of belligerency. And despite the fact that Hamas's attacks on October 7 are morally condemnable, obviously, they can also be seen as yet another futile attempt to break out of the ghetto to which Israel has confined Gazans since 2006. This point is important because Israel's supporters justify Israel's attack using the language of self-defense, which seems to meet the first condition of the justice of war. If, however, this is not a war, but another round of escalation, then there is no first condition that applies to it specifically. Rather, the first condition should be relevant to the state of war in general between the two sides, in which case I would argue Israel's war does not meet the first condition, an issue which we can take up in that discussion. Another reason to doubt that the first condition is met is that Israel continues to occupy the Gaza Strip, even though it withdrew its troops and settlements in 2005. The United Nations, Human Rights Watch, and other international bodies consider Gaza to be occupied because Israel continues to control Gaza's seas and air, to control what goes in and out of Gaza, and to control other aspects of Gazan life, such as the water and power supplies, telecommunications, and the population registry. So, So Gaza and the West Bank are not an independent state, which means that Israel may not invoke Article 51 of the United Nations Charter that allows states to fight in self-defense. According to Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories, quote, Israel cannot claim the right of self-defense against a threat that emanates from a territory that it occupies. End of quote. Imagine a really big and strong man sitting atop a small, skinny one, binding his limbs and his every movement. After months of this, the small man wrangles one arm free and, because of his very long fingernails, scratches and deeply wounds the big man's infant son, who is sitting nearby watching. The big man then proceeds to beat to a pulp the skinny man. Is the big man's beating understandable? In a way, yes. He is upset by and wants to avenge his son for being harmed. Is it self-defense? No. One does not self-defend oneself from an entity that is in the grip of one's own subjugation of it. Thus, it is questionable whether Israel's attack meets the first condition, despite what its defenders say. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that this is a war and a self-defensive one at that. Does it meet the other conditions? It meets only that of right authority, but it fails to meet the others. It does not meet the right intention condition because evidence indicates that Israel's intention is not just to attain its two stated aims of defeating Hamas and releasing the hostages, but to also exact revenge, terrorize the population, remove the population even, and perhaps commit genocide. What is the evidence? First, Israel's indiscriminate bombing. Second, the sayings of Israeli public officials about their intentions. Third, Israel's history of reprisals since 1948, amply documented by various historians. Fourth, Israel's intentions to attempt to move Gazans to somewhere outside of Gaza. And sixth, Israel's wounded pride after having been humiliated on October 7th. This evidence, which we can go into in detail later, this evidence supports the idea that Israel's intentions are not just self-defense, but include goals that are incompatible with the condition of right intention. Moreover, if Israel's conduct seems to neglect the welfare of the hostages, and if it believes or even suspects that Hamas cannot be militarily defeated, then these two aims might not even be part of its real intention. But I will not pursue this last point. Speaking of the goal of defeating Hamas, according to various news sources, Hamas are still fighting in areas of Gaza where Hamas was supposedly defeated. Moreover, that Hamas operates in tunnels and the fact that the Israeli army has been very hesitant to fight them in tunnels raises doubts about how much of Hamas Israel has been able to defeat. The point is not only military, but also political. Hamas's political leadership has so far been intact. Even if Israel manages to kill every Hamas fighter and leader, as long as the Palestinians continue to suffer occupation and injustice, either Hamas will be able to recruit new members or a new Hamas will emerge. This is a near law of subjugated peoples. They will find ways to resist as long as they exist and they are not spiritually broken. So this casts doubt on the fourth condition regarding the prospects of success. The fifth condition is also not met. It is difficult to see how the stated aims of defeating Hamas and rescuing the hostages can outweigh the death and destruction caused by Israel, especially since Hamas is not an enemy that even comes close to matching Israel's might, and since totally defeating it seems unlikely. Moreover, had Israel stated as another aim the comprehensive settlement of this conflict, including a Palestinian state at the end of the tunnel, this might have satisfied the fourth condition by implanting hope, which might have tempered the inevitable resentment and desires for revenge on the part of the Palestinians. Alas, this is not how it has happened. Finally, the condition of last resort. It is the most important because given the ugliness of war, parties to it must ensure that there are no means other than war to achieve their cause. Now, Israel could have released the hostages by non-violent means. Israel could have released the hostages through a hostage swap, given the 9,500 Palestinians currently incarcerated in its military prisons. Indeed, one of Hamas's stated aims in taking Israeli hostages on October 7 is to swap them with Palestinian prisoners, which is not an uncommon event in the history of this conflict. Israel could also have vowed to capture and try both the Hamas leaders responsible for October 7th and those who participated in it. Of course, this would not militarily defeat Hamas, but this does not mean that it needs to continue to threaten Israel, because through negotiations and a long-term agreement, Hamas can be persuaded to cease its attacks on Israel. Hamas has indeed offered and acted on long-term ceasefires with Israel in the past, based on international law and UN resolutions. So Israel has not genuinely exhausted obvious avenues to avoid not only this current war, but I would say even many other wars, such as 1967. I now turn to the conditions of the conduct of war. I will be brief. There are two crucial ones. First, discrimination. Belligerents must always distinguish between military objectives and civilians and intentionally attack only military objectives. Proportionality is the second condition, which is that foreseen but unintended harms must be proportionate to the military advantage achieved. Note here that the emphasis is on unintended but foreseen harms. The sheer number of civilians killed in Gaza indicates that Israel has not been discriminating in its war. Its bombing has targeted all and sundry and has caused the death so far of over 35,000 people and the maiming and orphaning of thousands of others. But it's not just the direct killing that is at issue. Israel has cut off food, water, and electricity and allows some rations to enter at will. The Gazan population is in a state of starvation. Israel has also bombarded hospitals, schools, universities, libraries, government buildings, factories, mosques, and churches, homes, and even uprooted cemeteries. None of these are military targets. So it seems to me that Israel is failing to discriminate. The second condition allows for civilian casualties as long as they are proportional to the military goals. It is unclear, however, how to determine this proportionality. But since this war has started, Israel has given a ratio of 2-1. Now, Israel has not provided any evidence to back this claim up, and the figures given by the health ministry of Gaza do not distinguish between civilians and fighters. So it is hard to come at the accurate number here. Moreover, Israel adopts a very broad definition of what it means to be a member of Hamas, which includes any affiliation with the organization, which includes civil servants. So I'm going to stop here because I'm running out of time, but I'm happy to take up anything else in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Raja. That was an excellent opening statement and very concise and very well worded and very persuasive. So with that, we will now go to Mark, who will provide his opening statement. Mark, you have 10 minutes.
Excellent, thank you. So firstly, I think Raja and I will agree about a few things. So firstly, the framework that Raja set out is a good framework to use to assess the justness of starting the war and then the justness of the conduct in the war. We're just going to disagree about whether the war is just and whether it has been conducted justly. So first of all, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about October 7th and what was perpetrated by Hamas. So I recently spent some time in Israel, and I went and visited some of the kibbutzes that had been massacred, and I went to the Nova site where hundreds of Israelis had been gunned down. In a lot of people's minds, they imagine that October 7th was merely a terror attack. But really what you had was battalions of Hamas soldiers breaking through the border, killing civilians en masse, sometimes with particular information that they had on them. So you had people who'd been working from Gaza in Israel on these kibbutzes, and they had maps on their bodies showing these are the people that you need to go and kill. So you had a very planned, coordinated attack. And the brutality of that attack is something that is almost unseen in modernity. People being burnt alive, mass amounts of sexual violence, knives put into people's genitalia, men and women, I might add. So huge levels of brutality. You also had attacks on not just civilians, but on the neighboring military base, and it took some time for that attack to be repelled. Now, it strikes me as absurd to say that under those conditions, when you've had the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, that Israel is not entitled to retaliate. That the Israelis obviously have an obligation to their own citizens to ensure that they are protected, that those that are intending on killing more of them, and Hamas has vowed to perform on October 7th again and again and again, to say that the Israelis have no right to self-defense strikes me as a special Israel rule. I can't imagine any other state who is dealing with that level of attack being told that you cannot defend your own citizens. The idea that Gaza is occupied by Israel, and that's the sort of language used by the Special Rapporteur. And of course, we must recognize that while the idea of a UN Special Rapporteur sounds like an independent body, that rapporteur was set up specifically with the mandate to find crimes committed by Israel. There's a biased mandate. And when you have Israelis who left Gaza in 2005, that you had elections, that Hamas killed its opponents in Gaza, so they murdered members of Fatah, seized control. It's true that they don't have unlimited control in the sense that the Israelis have erected a fence, that they control some access to resources, but you ultimately don't have Israelis that live in Gaza. And you don't have a military presence there up until October 7th because it's now become necessary. So it strikes me as strange to think that a sovereign state can't defend itself. Now, in terms of the conduct of the war, there are a couple of principles that are important. So the one is that you must distinguish between civilians and militants. So you cannot deliberately kill civilians. You must also ensure that your attacks are aiming at a legitimate military endeavor. So there are a couple that are legitimate. The one is to prevent Hamas from committing further crimes. So killing Hamas soldiers is a perfectly legitimate thing. The other one, of course, is that Israel finds itself in a tough neighborhood. That one of the reasons why it was caught by surprise was that there was much intelligence of attacks from the north, from Hezbollah. That one of the things that's not talked about very often is that you have 200,000 Israelis who have been displaced by the conflict, some of whom from the south, but many from the north. That you have tank missiles that come in from Syria and from Lebanon that have targeted Israeli homes. So you have many people who live in exile. And so it's quite important to be able to send a deterrent effect, that if the Israelis turn the other cheek, that they may very well then face a full-scale invasion, not just from Hamas, but from Hezbollah. And they did face a rocket fire from Iran. 300 missiles were sent over, which is a big escalation, because as much as Iran uses Hezbollah and Hamas as proxies to fight their battle, they haven't ever fought Israel directly. And so that existential threat is legitimate. So part of the way that Israel must conduct its war is to have a legitimate military aim, and part of that can be based on deterrence, and part of it is stopping other states, and part of it is stopping Hamas. Now, in terms of proportionality, one way of thinking about proportionality is to look at the numbers on both sides and to say, well, there were 1,200 people who were killed in Israel, and there's roughly 35,000 people who've been killed in Palestine, and this seems disproportionate. That's not how we do the exercise. The exercise is to ask, for every military strike, is the military gain that you get proportionate to the loss of civilian life that you will have? In other words, the laws of war don't prohibit the killing of civilians, they prohibit them directly killing. So it may be the case, for example, especially in the case of Hamas, when they use human shields, that when you are engaged in a war against them, that civilians will die. And that is often going to be at the hands of Hamas. So in a few ways. The one is, Raja mentioned that hospitals have been attacked, schools have been attacked, apartment buildings have been attacked. These are all because they've been used as military bases. That if you think about the recent rescue of those 4 Israeli hostages, they were above ground in apartments held by Palestinian civilians and Hamas fighters. So in order to rescue those people, and that is a primary objective for the Israelis, to ensure that they get their own citizens back, and I think one that any reasonable state would go to lengths to ensure that they get their civilians back home, you need to be able to engage in a conduct where you're going to be killing militants, and because those militants have embedded themselves in civilian areas, they have endangered the lives of those civilians. Raj and I are going to agree that it is an absolute tragedy that innocent civilians are losing their lives in this conflict. And it would be much better if they weren't losing their lives. But when we're allocating the blame, when we're trying to determine, is this just, we must ask, well, why are we in this situation? Hamas have, in some senses, held their civilian population captive. They are using them very cynically as human shields, partly in an effort to gain sympathy for the conduct of what they've done. That when reasonable people who have good hearts see footage of bombed out buildings, see footage of crying mothers, babies covered in rubble, they feel that this is a bad thing, and it is a bad thing. But when you do the moral exercise and you ask, why is this bad thing happening? It is because of Hamas. Now, it must be a legitimate aim to eradicate Hamas as a terror movement. I don't think it's as simple as being able to be targeted and just capturing the leaders of the movement, or being able to do a hostage deal where everyone could be rescued. Now, we are recording this on the 12th, and there have been discussions now at the moment, as there have been for a long time, for a ceasefire and for hostages to be handed over. This war could have come to an end very early. If Hamas laid down their arms and handed back the hostages, there wouldn't be a war. There wouldn't be Palestinian life endangered on that basis. The Israelis don't have any interest in conquering Gaza. It has no particular religious significance to Israel. What they would like is not to be attacked. What they would like is to be able to ensure that their own civilians are able to lead flourishing lives. And it's worth mentioning, of course, that Israel civilians are not just Jewish, that there are many people of many different faiths and races that live in Israel, some of whom are Muslim or Druze or Christian or Jewish, who come from different racial groups. If you think about some of the hostages that were taken by Hamas, they come from different faith backgrounds. They come from different parts of the world. Many held dual citizenship. And so there is this obligation to ensure, one, that that kind of attack never happens again, which means dismantling Hamas. Two, that all the civilians are brought back home. And one way to do that is through ensuring that there's military pressure on Hamas to ensure this deal. Three, performing acts of incredible bravery, like the one that was performed a few days ago, putting soldiers' lives at risk to ensure that they could rescue those captives. We must also recognize that if the Israelis had genocidal intent, they have the capacity to have killed many more people, and they haven't. They've often given warnings to people. They've asked civilians to leave certain areas so they can ensure that civilian life is protected. It is, of course, tragic that some civilians have lost their lives during this time, but it is not something that is part of Israel's objective to eradicate the Palestinians as a people.
So that concludes the opening statement portion of the debate. We will now transition into the rebuttal portion, which Raja will initiate. So Raja, now we'll begin your 5-minute rebuttal. So your time starts now.
All right, thank you. There are a lot of points to address, but I'm not going to be able to address all of them. I do want to comment very quickly on two things that Mark said, and then move on to more substantive comments. The one is the use of the term tragedy, which Mark used more than once. I don't think what's happening is a tragedy. Of course, what's happening is terribly bad, but tragedy is usually when something bad happens as a consequence of unforeseen circumstances and things beyond our control. I think what Israel is doing in Gaza is the deliberate killing of people, even if they are even if some of them are unforeseen, even if some of them are unintended but foreseen. When you foresee the death of someone and you go ahead and do it, I wouldn't describe this as a tragedy. There's also the other claim that what happened on October 7th was the largest number of Jews being killed since the Holocaust. That might be contested. I think in Argentina's dirty wars from between 1976 and 1983, about 30,000 leftist dissidents were killed by the regime, and many of the people there were Jews. Now, we don't have the exact number, but it might be something to keep in mind in terms of how many Jews the Argentinian state killed during those years, basically. So that was just very quickly that I wanted to mention. So I'm not going to contest what Hamas did on October 7th. I think what Hamas did is brutal. There have been different accounts of what Hamas were intending to do, but I'm not going to go there, except to say that when they attacked military installations, I think they were perfectly within their right to do so, given the blockade on Gaza. So that cannot be considered something that is banned. And Mark says that it is absurd to say that Israel cannot retaliate, given that there is an attack on this. I think, given the realism of the situation, of course, everyone expects Israel to retaliate, because this has been the logic of this conflict. As a matter of fact, I would say since its inception, Israel was born in blood. I mean, the number of Jewish attacks, terrorist attacks against the British and against the Arabs in the formative years of the Israeli state were just horrendous, right? And since Israel became a state, every time it got attacked or every time it comes up with an excuse that something happened, it retaliates with full force. I mean, just take one example, 1953, the attack on the West Bank village, which was under Jordanian control, of Qibya, right? They demolished the entire village just because they thought that there were 2 or 3 people who came from that village, probably most of them who were refugees, and they were going to, So this has been the modus operandi for Israel to act all the time, with this military might and asserting its power. So given the realism of the situation, yeah, it might sound that it's absurd, but if you look at this from a slightly more morally elevated perspective, I don't think it's absurd at all to say this. I mean, Israel could have easily taken other paths in this. So I'm just going to stop there because we can go into it later too. Now, another claim that Mark says is that Israel lives in a tough neighborhood and that it is, continuously threatened by existential threats. I think Israel definitely has enemies in the neighborhood. I mean, Hezbollah, as Mark said, is not a friend of Israel, right? Iran is not a friend of Israel. But I do want to say two things. First of all, the Iranian attack on Israel was one of the most absurd attacks that I've ever seen. It was actually forecasted beforehand. They knew exactly that the drones were going to be shut down. I mean, there is no question that Iran thought they were going to be able to do anything against Israeli military might. They know that. The second thing I would like to say is that sometimes defenders of Israel talk as if they have zero sense of the actual realism of the political situation over there. From what we know about Iran, it doesn't seek a military conflict with Israel. It is going to lose the military conflict with Israel. What Iran seeks is some sort of political hegemony in the region. Now, put Iran aside. Let's go to Hezbollah. Let's go to Hamas. What do they seek? People claim now that they seek the destruction of Israel. But again, that is a misreading of the political situation. Hamas and Hezbollah are both political parties that have a religious aspect to them, that have grown out of what they consider to be an Israeli occupation and oppression. So, for example, when was Hezbollah born? Hezbollah was born in 1982 during the Israeli occupation of the south of south of Lebanon, and almost all their attacks until 2000, when Israel withdrew from Lebanon, were against Israeli military installations, basically, right? And the same thing with Hamas. So So what I'm trying to say is that when Israel, and I'm going to address this in my closing statement, and maybe it will come up when Israel finally decides that those people whom it has been denying their rights since 1948 and even before finally deserve a state, when Israel decides to say, okay, I'm going to bless the Palestinians with a state, these things are going to wither away. Now, whether eliminating Hamas, which is something else that Mark said, is a worthwhile goal, I'm not going to comment on. I certainly think eliminating Hamas as a military threat to Israel is important, because we don't want any nation in the region. We don't want the civilians to be killed. I mean, this is a war that has taken its toll on everyone, right? But ultimately, the important thing about eliminating Hamas is to make sure that both people are living in peace and security with each other, right? Whether that means Hamas continues as a political party, maybe. But what's crucial is that neither side is a threat to the other side, basically. And I would say, given the sheer amount of deaths on both sides, Israel has had the upper hand in how many people it has killed in this conflict.
Perfect. Thank you, Raja. That was amazing as always, and also as predicted. So thank you very much for your rebuttal. With that, we will now go to Mark for his rebuttal. Mark, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, so I think we must recognize that you've had an ongoing conflict for a long period of time, that the means used by the parties are quite different, and that they wouldn't be tolerated in other situations. So if you think about the security barrier wall that's in Jerusalem, Israelis look at that and they say it as a blight on the landscape. You've got this wonderful sacred city that's a sacred place for many people, and you have the security barrier, and they hate it. But it has to be there because in the 90s, you had people strapping bombs to their chest and blowing themselves up on buses that you can sit in restaurants where there is shrapnel on the wall still from suicide attacks. That kind of extreme death cult violence is something that you don't find in many parts of the world. That ability to say that I will be a martyr for a grand cause and I will deliberately kill women and children in service of this cause is not something that you find in other places. I think it's important that when we're evaluating Israel, we do a couple of things. The one is to try and say, what would other states do? What are the kinds of things that we tolerate in the conduct of war? And what do other states actually have to deal with? So, thank goodness, most European nations don't deal with existential threats in the way that Israel does. They're not surrounded by states that have attacked them on prior occasions, that have tried to wipe them out, that continue to fire rockets at them, or that deliberately try and kill their civilian base. So you can imagine calling for more genteel methods of resolution. It would be wonderful if everyone could live in peace, but it does require both sides to want that. And it's not clear to me that Hamas want that. They aren't saying, we would love to live in peace with our brothers next door. They're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which means we want the eradication of the Israeli state. that if you zoom out on that map and you look at the size of Israel and you compare it to all of the surrounding states, which are largely homogenous in nature, that they are Islamic only states, that if you are not Muslim and you live in those states, you don't live as an equal person, that there are many Jews who used to live in North Africa and the Middle East, and they fled. Some because they wanted a better life in Israel, and some because they could no longer continue their lives where they were living. Now, part of the purpose of Israel is to be a safe haven place. It's part of its role was to provide refuge for those that were escaping the Holocaust, to build up new lives. And part of why the October 7th attack is so dramatic is that it pierces that bubble. It sends a signal that Jews will not be safe and Jews are not welcome. Now, I would, of course, love it if people could live together side by side, and Jews and Muslims and Druze do live together side by side in Israel, that you can lead a life of your choosing to a large degree in Israel. If you are gay, you can lead an openly gay life in Israel. I don't think you could lead an openly gay life in the West Bank, in Gaza, or many of the surrounding Arab states. So on the one hand, you have a choice between a nation that really is a pluralist nation, that welcomes people of different stripes, that when Israel was declared independence, it made it quite clear that it was not a Jewish-only state, that it was a state for those who lived in it as well. And of course, when they declared independence, you had attacks from the surrounding states. Many lost their lives during that time, and Israel survived. They faced many attacks that could have led to them being extinguished, were it not for their military might. Of course, it would be nice if the Israelis didn't have to invest so much money in a military, because it's obviously better to be investing yourself in productive things and to be building, and the Israelis have built. Hamas, on the other hand, haven't. That much of the aid that has flowed into Gaza, and there's aid that comes from nations all around the world, has been used to build terror tunnels, has been used to fire rockets. That instead of using the water pipes that were there, that were donated to them for supplying water, they're used to kill innocents on the other side. And this is a true tragedy.
Okay, perfect. Very nice. All right. So now what we will do is we will transition into the cross-examination section. So Raja will ask questions of Mark for 10 minutes, sort of in the legalistic style that Mark is so accustomed to. And with that, Raja, you have 10 minutes.
Sure. Thank you. I thought before we started that I'm not going to have any cross-examination questions, but now I feel like I do quite have a few. So let me start with a couple that I'm not sure how that was a rebuttal to my opening statement, Mark, because you seem to basically throw at me a number of things that you tend to find on a typical pro-Israeli websites. They seem to be a little bit not historically grounded, but that's fine. I'm going to ask a couple of questions anyway. So one of the things you say is that gays outside that gays outside Israel don't live a very comfortable life. They can be persecuted, but I just fail to see how this is relevant. I mean, let's suppose that it is true. All right, let's suppose that gays in the Muslim world are persecuted. It's not true of Lebanon. I mean, for example, gays in Lebanon and Morocco, for instance, have gay rights organizations. Of course, it's true in other parts of the country. But then the same is true of Israel. I mean, if you go to Jerusalem and you try to be gay in Jerusalem, where the religious nuts usually rule, I'm sorry to say it, it's going to be hard for you to have a gay pride parade, right? If you go to Tel Aviv, it's a different question. But my question is, number one, what does this have to do with the fact that Israel has been oppressing the Palestinians for a long time? I mean, you don't seem to deny that. You seem to accept the fact that there is this oppression that's going on, but then you retreat and you say things like, well, Israel is always threatened, but then you say everybody has equality in it. So I'm wondering what that has to do with it. And then I have another question, but once you answer this one, I'll ask you. Yes, go ahead.
Sure. So part of it is, if the idea is that you could have a solution where everybody lives alongside each other in one state, then to point out that you have very different values in those two different regions shows you the incompatibility of that. So I don't think you could be openly gay in Gaza. I think you would get killed. And so it's not clear to me that if you tore down that security barrier between Gaza and Israel and you had one state, that you would be able to have compatible values. I imagine that many people that are that hold values that are incompatible with those held by Hamas or the other Gazan citizens would face persecution and experience real oppression. Part of some of the case that I've given about restricting access to sites, that might feel oppressive. In other words, to not be able to travel from the West Bank into Israel freely may feel oppressive. But it is unfortunately there because there's a prior history of terrorist activity. As I said, on October 6th, you had Gazans coming in to Israel to work on kibbutzes. And then they used the intelligence they gathered to go and kill the very left-wing people that lived on those kibbutzes, those that hungered for nothing more than peace. So I raise those examples to show that, one, there is a reason why the Palestinians find themselves in the situation they have. It's not because the evil Israelis like kicking them in the teeth. It's because they've had to protect themselves against extreme acts of belligerence. And the other one is that you have very different value sets in those two parts of the world. That makes it very hard to imagine a unified country.
So before I ask my question, I'm just going to say something vague. This question of incompatible values just doesn't seem convincing to me, because if you look at virtually any country in the world, they're going to have constituents that have incompatible values. I mean, just look at the United States. You think that Republicans and Democrats have compatible values? Of course they don't. If Trump doesn't get elected president, we might be on the verge of civil war in this country, right? Of which sort of underscores your point. But my general point is that almost every country in the world, unless it's completely homogeneous, which I don't think they exist, you're going to have people with incompatible values. They manage to live with each other, right? I don't see why that cannot be true of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, even if Hamas is against gay rights, basically. And the second thing I want to mention is that the kind of oppression I'm talking about is not the inability of a Palestinian to travel from the West Bank to Israel, right? The kind of oppression that I'm talking about is, first of all, the oppression that you see in the blockade of Gaza. Second of all, the oppression that you see in the West Bank, where you have two systems, one for the Palestinians, one for the Israelis, which is really apartheid. This is what people talk about when they refer to the Israeli system as apartheid. You have settlements that have taken over the whatever future Palestinian state they're supposed to have. Those settlements are connected by a network of roads that only Jews can use, basically. You have checkpoints everywhere. Israeli soldiers basically making Palestinians' lives miserable. The settlers making lives even more miserable, abetted by the Israelis. That's the kind of oppression that I'm talking about. And I'm also talking about the kind of oppression in which you have millions of Palestinian refugees who were kicked out of their land in 1948, basically, never allowed to return, whose lands were confiscated and made part of the Jewish state, inalienable. They cannot be sold to anyone else. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. These are the kind of festering wounds that the Palestinians still rightly complain of, and that Israel has refused over the years to basically give any serious concessions to, which I'm happy. But here's my next question to you. Let's talk about Israel itself a little bit. You want to say that one of the things is that Israel is a country of equality for all people. How is that reconcilable with the fact that Israel defines itself as the Jewish state, of how recently the Knesset wanted to pass a law that basically entrenches the idea that Israel is a Jewish state? Any Jew around the world can actually go to Israel and get citizenship upon entry, basically, whereas Palestinians who were kicked out in 1948 are denied the right to go back to their lands, right? How is this a state of equality? How is it that when Israeli Palestinians are not allowed to serve in the army, and when serving in the army comes with a series of packages of benefits and privileges that are not allotted to Palestinian Israelis precisely because they're not allowed to serve in the army, how is that a state of equality? How is it a state of equality when Palestinians in Israel are not allowed to often buy more and more land simply because they're not Jewish? They're not giving. How is that a state of equality? How is it a state of equality when the state of Israel allocates way more resources to Jewish villages and towns than it does to? There was actually a show that's very funny. I don't have time to go into it, but it basically shows you in a humorous way of how this state of inequality between Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis exists in the country. So yeah, I understand that Israel is a democracy in the sense that even non-Jewish Israelis are able to vote. But if you look at a whole set of other laws that Israel has, it's actually not democratic in this respect at all, basically. It doesn't compare. It doesn't. I mean, let me put it this way. Israel is the only country in the world that distinguishes between Jewish nationality and Israeli citizenship. So if I were a Palestinian Israeli, right, I will have the Israeli passport, I will have the Israeli citizenship, but on my ID card, it will say that I am Druze, right? It will not say that and so my nationality is Jewish, yet supposedly Israel is supposed to be a state for all its people, but it also defines itself as the Jewish state. And it also lays claim on all the Jews around the world. So this is what doesn't compute as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, if you can address that, that would be great. Sorry, that was a long-winded question, and I used it also to explicate more points that I wanted to say.
I'll try and deal with some of that complexity. So, if part of the purpose of Israel is really to be a safe haven for Jews that face persecution, what they did was to say, are you the kind of person who would have been killed by the Nazi regime? So it's not whether you're a practicing Jew, it's really dealt with on a racial bloodline basis. So if you're Jewish enough to be put into a gas chamber, then you're Jewish enough to become a citizen of Israel. And so that is the promise of the state of Israel. So in that sense, it is a state that is meant to be welcoming for Jews. It is the only state that sets up in that manner. And as I say, Israel takes up an enormous amount of space in your newspaper, but a very small amount of space on the planet. It's about the size of New Jersey. And as I say, is completely dwarfed by all of the neighboring countries around there. And there are many Muslim-only states where it's not just a matter of Muslim-only, but entrenching Muslim law. Whereas if you're in Israel, you have a very mixed legal system. You have British influences, French influences, Arabic influences, Jewish influences. You have Arabs who are in the Knesset. Arab doctors who are working on Israeli patients. The apartheid claim strikes me as a sinister one. As a South African, who has a deep knowledge of what apartheid entailed. I was at a talk last night with Reverend Kenneth Mushwe, who's a black Christian. He said, during apartheid, he went out to Israel and he looked for the Jews-only beaches and the Jews-only hospitals and the Jews only allowed to serve in these political offices and didn't find that. He found enormous amounts of integration. Now, you're right to point out that there's a restriction on Palestinians serving in the army. And this shouldn't be too puzzling, given that obviously those Gazans who went and worked in the south used the intelligence they gathered to perform this horrendous massacre, which you and I both condemn. So there is, of course, a security risk in who you allow into your army. A good friend of mine's son is going to be signing up for the British Army. And because he was born in South Africa, he will not be able to participate in military intelligence. So states do restrict, for good reason, who participates on those endeavors.
All right, Mark, go ahead.
So I'm interested to find out what you think the legitimate forms of resistance can be taken. Whether you think that Palestinians have additional things that they should be able to take that are different from other states because of their situation.
I think people who are occupied, who are oppressed in general by clear state entities, obviously have a right to resist. I think this right is also enshrined in international law. It's a more recent development, I think, in international law, but it's there. I don't think resistance is not a carte blanche for for the resistors just to kill any and sundry. I think there is an interesting essay by Andrew Walls, who's a political philosopher from a while ago, in which he argues that the rules of just war also applies to non-state combatants, because for a long time we thought just laws used to apply to only states. So I'm in general agreement with Walls about the fact that the rules of just war can also apply to non-state combatants or non-state resistors. So that means that they also have to abide by the discrimination condition when the conduct of war, and they have to abide by the general. So this is what I think is allowed and is not allowed. Now, when you go to specific contexts of different conflicts, you're going to have, obviously, the details are going to differ. The interesting thing about the Palestinian situation is that it is unique in many respects, right? So even though, so for example, according to international law, the Palestinians should have a state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? These UN resolutions have never come to fruition, basically, for a number of reasons. So it's a cause that has been neglected for a long time. First of all, I think a very strong case can be made that Israel actually wants the entire land for its own state. I mean, especially the West Bank. I think one prime minister after another, including the ones that we consider to have been peacemakers, like Yitzhak Rabin, for example, he stated on numerous occasions that the Palestinians will never get the entire West Bank. I mean, we don't need to go into details of this, but Judea and Samaria, as the West Bank is called by some by some Israelis, has always been part of the Zionist enterprise, so to speak. And then that's number one. And number two, the Arab states have basically failed the Palestinians. I mean, most of the Arab states, despite what Israeli people like to say about their belligerency, the historical record shows otherwise. So, for example, the King of Jordan early in 1947 had colluded with the Israelis. He's had a number of meetings with Golda Meir, for instance, who wasn't a prime minister back then, obviously, but they had a number of meetings to divide the lands between them, where the Jordan would get the West Bank. Even the Arab president, who's touted as having been the most eternal enemy of Israel, the Egyptian president Jamal Abdel Nasser, who took power in the early 1950s, basically, even he was actually in constant talks with Israel soon after the State of Israel was established, in order to basically make a peace treaty with Israel. And the year when Jamal Abdel Nasser actually basically said, "I've had it," was after the Gaza raid, which was in 1955, when Israel went into Gaza and destroyed and killed about 37 Egyptian soldiers without any obvious provocation, basically. Syria also at the time, they offered Ben Gurion, who was the prime minister at the time, they said, "Let's have a peace settlement. We're willing to take in a number of Palestinian refugees if you are willing to absorb some of them also." Ben Gurion, in the height and drunk with victory, said, "No, this is not going to happen," right? So the Arabs have tried to help the Palestinians, but they've never come close to them. With the Abrahamic Accords recently, we've seen Saudi Arabia willing to normalize relationships, and so on and so forth. So the Palestinians have been denied their state by the Israelis. They have been let down by the Arab world. The United States, another factor, which is supposed to have been a neutral arbiter in all of this, has shown blatant. Anybody who reads the record has shown blatant bias towards Israel. So the Palestinians seem to be in a situation in which they have very few options other than resistance, basically, is what I'm trying to say. They have exhausted a number of political means, although I wouldn't deny that the PLO engaged in terrorist actions at the beginning, right? But their situation is unique in the sense that it has been a festering conflict since 1948, and they haven't been able to have a political solution to it. So if any group is allowed resistance or has the right to resist, it would be the Palestinians, it seems to me.
So I'd like to look at an analogous case. If you have an organization like ISIS, which strike me as a dangerous death cult that the world viewed as a dangerous death cult. And at one point, they're in the news pretty regularly, the idea of setting up this caliphate where they would oppress women and burn journalists in cages. So in the recapturing of Mosul, about 40,000 civilians died, which again strikes me as a terrible thing when civilians die. Was that justified to eradicate ISIS?
I think it is justified to eradicate ISIS, but whether by doing so, by killing 40,000 civilians, is the question, isn't it? Right? And I'm not sure whether so. The goal of getting rid of ISIS is justified. So if you apply the justice of the war, I think that makes perfect sense. Whether the conduct of the war is justified is a whole different question to me. But I would also like to say that the analogy with ISIS is not a very proper analogy. Hamas has not done anything to non-Muslims or to those Muslims that they consider not to be conform to their kind of Islam. They have been at pains to basically say that women are not obliged to wear the hijab in the Gaza Strip, right? But also, ISIS is not a nationalist movement. ISIS is a pan-nationalist movement. It's a movement that doesn't have any national boundaries, that tries to establish a certain type of Islamic law by force, right? So getting rid of ISIS seems to me a very important goal. And also, ISIS doesn't have the kind of grassroots backing that resistance groups like Hezbollah and Hamas do. So I find problems with the analogy there, but I hope that answered the question.
Yes, very useful. I then wonder about how you think Israel ought to have responded to October 7th. If it was not to engage in a war, if they had no right of self-defense, what should they have done?
That's a difficult question, because there is what I would have thought Israel should have done under a realist sense versus what I think Israel should have done under an idealist sense. Right now, here's what I mean by a realist sense. There is a reality to the state of Israel that no one can deny, which is that it is what's the expression? It's a trigger happy state, right? Basically, everyone knows that Israel is very happy to fire and to and to engage in massive military operations. We can go into examples. We don't have to. And so the world and the Israeli public has come to expect that war is the first answer, right? So, for example, there was a report on the news the other day about the northern border with Lebanon and Israel, and about how so many people in the northern Galilee in Israel, are basically saying, well, the only way to stop the Hezbollah attacks is to basically have the army engage in another war with Lebanon, basically. So there is this mentality, I think, that is a part of the realism of the situation, in which we all expect Israel to respond militarily. Now, under that mentality, within that framework, I would have expected Israel to at least to resort to specific assassinations of Hamas leaders. I mean, they could have done that. Israel has the kind of intelligence, basically, that far supersedes any other country in the region. As a matter of fact, a lot of the 1967 war against Syria was won because Israeli intelligence was able to intercept a letter that was sent about Syrian capabilities. Anyway, I'm not trying to show off my historical knowledge, but I'm trying to make a point about the strength of Israeli intelligence. They have been able to go after Iranian officials and other officials in Syria, for example. They knew exactly where they lived, right? So if we are to go with a military option, then Israel could have gone after certain Hamas leaders, basically. That's one option, without engaging in this devastating war. The reason why I think Israel engaged in this devastating war is because Palestinians have always been a thorn in the moral side of Israel. And the more it gets rid of them, the more it can rest in peace, in the sense that they don't have to deal with this nagging moral sword over their heads, right? But in an ideal framework, so I mentioned the military form, in an ideal framework, as I said in my comments, Israel could have asked for the leaders of Hamas to be tried in some international tribunal, basically. I think the world would have been more than happy to help Israel with this, because what happened on October 7th was a devastating attack in many ways, right? So I think Israel would have gotten international cooperation with this, and also Israel would have demonstrated to the world and to the Palestinians that, look, we are serious about finally ending this conflict. So in addition to asking for Hamas leaders to be tried and trying to obtain them, Israel should also basically say to the Palestinians, look, we know that this has come out of desperation. We know that groups such as Hamas are being able to have life and vitality because we are breeding those conditions. And so we will start negotiations again in post haste, right? Of course, the fact that Netanyahu is a prime minister doesn't help, because depending on who the prime minister is, you can have more elbow room.
All right, perfect. Thank you for an incredible debate and an interchange and a cross-examination that was very fruitful. So now what we are going to do is transition into the open discussion section. So just like one throat clearing before we begin. If anybody in the audience has any questions that have cropped up during the course of the debate, myself and Steve will be looking through the comments to fish out all of the questions, and we'll be asking them for the people in the audience. With that said, we'll now transition to questions. Steve, if you want to start out, you can.
Sure. So I'm going to ask a question from a guest named Burkay, and it says, given the size of the munitions and the densely populated nature of Gaza, half of the bombs falling within 100 to 300 meters of the target indicates indiscriminate bombing. After all, the area outside of the 100-meter circle is much wider than the target. The overwhelming majority of the injuries and deaths would have happened would happen outside the target area. So I guess the question is, has Israel engaged in the use of indiscriminate bombing, and have they used dumb munitions, which suggests that they're not, in terms of the conduct of war, they're not satisfying justice with regard to the way in which war is conducted. And I gather this is a question for Mark.
Yes, well, I suppose what you're trying to work out when you're evaluating Israeli conduct is it meeting the requirements that Raja and I agree on? And is it operating in a way that is similar to other kinds of conflicts? So I can't comment on a strike-by-strike basis whether everyone is going to be meeting those thresholds. Part of it is you have to sort of think of what the test really is, which is the military commander themselves must engage in an exercise where they are working out is it permissible for us to take this strike given the aims that we have in mind and the foreseeable loss of civilian life? Now, what the Israelis do is that every strike requires permission from the lawyers inside the Israeli army. So you have people who are asking, is this permissible? Is this okay? You have a record of that as well. So you have the ability to sort of assess afterwards, well, was this permissible? Was it not permissible? And there have been times when, there have been statements from the Israeli government saying this particular strike wasn't permissible, or we're concerned about this, or we're concerned about this statement or this particular bit of behavior. I think we are dealing with a war that has the most heightened scrutiny on it. I think for some time there was discussion about what the Russians were doing in Ukraine, and there was some sense of this is bad conduct and the Russians should be censured. But you don't have the kind of blow-by-blow analysis, the breathless sort of look at every single strike that you have around the world in this conflict. I'd imagine that a lot of people are quite surprised to hear that in Mosul, 40,000 civilians lost their lives. Almost no discussion about that. But every time someone loses their lives in this conflict, there is an uproar. The South African government goes to the ICJ, claims that there's further evidence of genocide. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't scrutinize what's going on, and you really must apply the principles. But some of it is going to be difficult to do in the fog of war. You need to be able to ask those that authorize the strikes, why did you do it? And they might be able to give you a very good answer.
Okay, perfect. So next, we're going to go to a question from Rima. So this is a question for Mark. You oppose a one-state structure with equal rights with the claim that Israelis and Palestinians have very different values, implying that they can't therefore live together. Isn't the Jewish population itself very diverse in terms of values? Why should the division depend on religious affiliation? Also, let's say we accept your premise that Jews and non-Jews are fundamentally incompatible. That doesn't explain why the colonizing religious/ethnic group should be given privileges. Can you explain why Jews must be structurally privileged in terms of land, civil human rights, access to resources?
So, firstly, I'll sort of set out what my actual claims are. What I said was that Jews and Muslims and Christians and Druze actually live in relative harmony in Israel. It's not that it's incompatible for them to live with each other. And it is true that Jews themselves hold a variety of different values. Many Israelis are secular, and some Israelis are ultra-Orthodox. And there are lots of internal tensions about how to try and accommodate everyone's interests. So it's not my claim that it's incompatible for Arabs and Israelis to live side by side, or for Muslims and Jews to live side by side. They do live side by side, and it works. What's incompatible is incorporating people who've been living under the rule of Hamas since 2005, who've been indoctrinated into a death cult, who believe that Israel has no right to exist, who have an extreme hatred of Jews. When you have, and Raja mentioned before, extreme acts of terrorism, people who are willing to strap bombs to themselves to kill ordinary civilians, it's not sensible to say that those people can live side by side. So we do think that sometimes it's important for nations to be able to determine their own destiny. That in Europe you had, think about the Soviet Union, people who'd lived alongside each other in one conglomeration for a long period of time, and then were able to determine their own destiny with their own states. And it does seem like most sensible people call for a multi-state solution to the Israel-Palestine crisis. Now, you could have the two-state solution, but given that Gaza and the West Bank are non-contiguous and run by different governments, you might think that it's preferable to have a three-state solution. But a one-state solution, it's either, it seems to be the position taken by maybe people who are very hopeful on both sides. So you get those that imagine everybody could live in harmony and that there will be no fallout when you combine the populations and tear down the walls, and others that want an ethno-state in one character or the other. In other words, there will be some Jewish nationalists say we should have one state and it should just be for Jews, and we should take all their territory. And then you'll have let's say people in Hamas say there should be one state and we should kill all the Jews. It'll be our state, just like all the other states around the area. So, one where everybody holds their hand sounds great to me. It just doesn't seem to be one that's realizable given the facts on the ground.
Can I say something quick? I think one aspect to Rima's question is that given the law of return that Israel has, the argument that people cannot live together if they have incompatible values seems to be weak, on the assumption that Jews come from different parts of the world, culturally different, right? So if Israel is willing to do that, why isn't it willing to do that with non-Jews? Now that takes me to your part of the question, and I have to say, Mark, just to be a little bit honest, I think it's a bit slanderous to basically call out an entire people and say that they are all brainwashed by Hamas and they just want the death of the Jews. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Palestinian psyche, basically. And it's a problem because if you keep saying things like that, you are basically tarnishing an entire population with the wrong description. So yeah, Palestinians want to break out of this blockade that Israel has put under them, but that doesn't mean that they hate Jews. As a matter of fact, most Palestinians understand quite well that Israel is here to stay. No one has the illusion that the Jews are going to be kicked out into the sea. I mean, you might have some people here and there who want that, but so the Palestinians fully understand this, and they don't want to hate the Jews or kill the Jews. And it feels even silly for me to say this. What they actually want is just this yoke to be lifted off their neck, basically, so they can live in equal dignity and freedom with the Israelis, whether as part of a single state or a two-state. So, yeah.
I mean, I wish that was true. I really do. I really wish that there were a large number of Palestinians who lived in Gaza who said, we just want peace. And I'm sure there are some people like that who really do and who don't like being held captive by a sinister organization like Hamas. But unfortunately, there are enough people who don't value Jewish life, who are willing to engage in mass acts of massacre, rape, torture, deliberately target civilians, are willing to hold them captive in their own homes. You don't have that on the other side. You don't have Israelis who are running raids into Gaza, capturing civilians and holding them hostage in their homes. You don't have indiscriminate fire going in just for the hell of it. You do have it on a regular basis, Hamas firing rockets. So, as I say, it would be nice. I really would like it if you had that. I think there's going to have to be what I politely refer to as a denazification project. That one way to ensure that you don't have an ongoing crisis is that you're going to have people change their values. And when I say incompatibility of values, there's obviously a Rawlsian pluralist sense in which those who hold different views about the good life can live alongside each other. But when the one view is the other side doesn't deserve to live and shouldn't be here, that's not compatible. And so a variety of life values can work, and it does work in Israel, but there's a sense in which they're mutually incompatible because they require the destruction of the other. That's not something that you can put into one state.
Aren't there expressions in Israeli Hebrew that basically denigrate the Arabs? So, for example, when you say this is Arab labor, this is an expression that basically says you get what you pay for. The point that I'm trying to make is that Israelis themselves, Jewish Israelis, are very much racist towards the Arabs. I mean, Israeli school books are filled with with a certain way of portraying the Arabs that is incredibly hostile. Now, do I blame Israel for this? Yeah, to some extent. But what I'm trying to say is that in any conflict like this, you're bound to have these kind of things. But I also want to add, I think the claims you're making on behalf of the Palestinians are just not true. I think you don't know the Palestinians very well. And I think you're getting those claims basically from I don't know where you're getting them from, but they're simply not true. And I urge you to come to know more Palestinians. And next time you go to Israel, I think try to go to the West Bank, try to Gaza. It's very difficult for you to go to, right? But try to mix with the Palestinian population. There are countless accounts of Jews who went to Israel, who were basically Israel cannot be wrong, basically, and they have come to see the way that the Palestinians live. They have come to interact with the Palestinians. There are people who actually lived in Gaza and who basically claim, and people knew that I was Jewish. And I've never felt threatened ever in my life. I think this whole picture that the Palestinians just hate the Jews because they're Jews is a story that a lot of Israelis like to tell themselves about why they have to maintain this military armor all the time. But it's not true.
So now we're going to transition to some of Steve and I's questions. So Steve, why don't you go ahead?
So I guess my question for Raja is, do you think that Israel is a legitimate state? And separately, do you think it has a right to exist? You might think those are Same question. I think those are different questions. And how does your answer to that question affect the permission with regard to violence? But again, my primary question is: does Israel have a right to exist? And perhaps the same question: is it a legitimate state?
Israel obviously has the right to exist in as much as any other state has a right to exist. Now, I don't believe that states as such have rights to exist. Whatever rights states have derive from their ability to maintain their population and their welfare and to take care of them. And so, I mean, that, there are large discussions about this in political philosophy, obviously, what justifies the state. So Israel, like any other state, has a right to exist, but that right to exist has also needs to be limited by other people's claims on the state of Israel. So, for example, if the state of Israel is able to maintain itself only as a Jewish state and at the expense of the Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and then later in 1967, then no, Israel doesn't have a right to exist in that respect, because there are other people who have similar claims to that territory that Israel is continuously denying them. So now, this doesn't mean that Israel cannot exist as a Jewish state, because it is perfectly compatible for Israel to be a Jewish state. In other words, to be a beacon for all the Jews around the world who want to live there as a refuge from whatever it is that they want to live a refuge from. But also at the same time, not be an exclusive state, not deny Palestinians their rights.
So just a quick follow-up on that. So if Israel is running an apartheid state and denying the property rights of millions of Palestinians and engaging in unjustified violence, why wouldn't that show that it does not have a right to exist in virtue of its actions?
Because I think there seems to be a false dilemma here, either between saying a state doesn't have the right to exist unless it's a perfect state, or a state has the right to exist no matter what. No state is perfect in the world, right? So they all engage in certain forms of rights violation. That doesn't mean that we just say the state has no right to exist, because we can also say that the state can be reformed, right? So even though Israel engages in forms of apartheid against the Palestinians, even though Israel denies Palestinian refugees entry, blah, 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 I'm not going to jump to the quick conclusion that Israel as a state shouldn't exist. Maybe Israel has a right to exist, but its existence must also be compatible with the rights of others. Now, again, I repeat, this is not some sort of strange group knocking on Israel's door wanting a piece of the pie. No, the Palestinians are indigenous to the land, basically, and they have always been part of the land for centuries. As a matter of fact, I would bet that most Palestinians today are descendants of Jews. If I were to do one of those DNA tests, I don't know what they show, but probably I'm going to end up being Jewish. Most of my Palestinian friends are going to be Jewish. So yeah, Israel has the right to exist as a state, but not exclusively for Jews and not at the expense of the right of others, given their previous rights to the land, to the territory.
All right, perfect. So we're going to go to a question from Rebecca, and that question is to Raja. It says, do you deny that Hamas's ideology is anti-Semitic at its core? That the ideology Hamas embodies is explicitly anti-Jewish? Leave aside Palestinian civilians, but Hamas.
Yeah, I deny it. Hamas's charter basically calls for getting rid of the Zionist ideology, the Zionist state, and establishing an Islamic state in Palestine. Now, we should all know that Islamic states have always held Christians and Jews as, they've always labeled them as people of the book, basically, right? So they've always considered them. So, for example, in the Quran, by the way, this is not a defense of Hamas. This is only, what I'm trying to do here is to basically clarify certain things that people often claim about Hamas. So Hamas wants to have an Islamic state in Palestine, or at least it used to. So I'll talk about the political reality in answer to Rebecca's question. But putting the political reality aside for a minute, what Hamas's charter used to call for was an Islamic state in all of Palestine. Now, this doesn't mean that no Jews can be there, or Christians. Hamas is very well aware of the existence of Jews and Christians since time immemorial, basically. But what it does mean is that under Islamic rule, they will have to have the status of Jews and Christians according to Islam. Now, is this status a glorified status? Obviously not. I mean, Islam considers, even though they consider Christians and Jews to be people of the book, they still have some sort of a lower status than Muslims do, and they have to pay a certain kind of tax because of their status, and so on and so forth. But does this mean that they're anti-Semitic? No, not in any sense that we're used to from the kind of European anti-Semitism that we have. So that answers the ideological question. Now, to go to the practical question, I think when you look at Hamas's announcements and the offers of hudnas to Israel, you will basically see a decline over the years of their resort to their charter as part of their platform. As a matter of fact, I think a number of Hamas leaders are now embarrassed by that charter. They're very much aware of how the world has used it against them, whether this is a strategic point or not. They have basically abandoned talk of this charter. And so they have offered Israel a number of long-term truces, a number of hudnas, and when they ran for elections in 2005, they have basically agreed to potentially to be part of the Palestinian Authority program. What that means is that they have agreed on a two-state solution. So you have to also look at the practicalities on the ground, Rebecca. You can't just go by that charter.
Perfect. So I have a question for Mark next. In my cross-examination style of asking question. So, Mark, what I want to know is what is the maximally acceptable ratio of civilian and unjust combatants kill ratio? I want to ask that question. So, for instance, let's suppose it's 7-1. Suppose why not 12-1?
Yeah, I think you're right to point out that there's going to be some Sorites problem here when we're trying to work out what's justifiable. So one way to think about what's acceptable is with reference to other facts. So if you're looking at civilian casualty ratios to militants, you should say, well, what are the other wars that have gone on? What do those numbers look like? Is this in the region? Is this a different kind of conflict? So, for example, when you're dealing with these numbers and you have roughly a 2-1 number, and Raja's right to say it's hard to work out the exact numbers for a couple of reasons. The one is the death toll is reported by Hamas, who run the Gaza Health Ministry. The militant ratio is estimated by the Israelis. We know that Hamas has got two sets of numbers on the death toll. So the one is what they call identified deaths. So in other words, they can show the deaths. And then the other one is reported deaths, where there's an assumption that these people are dead, or that there's some other kind of external evidence besides the body to say that they're dead. And there's quite a big disparity. So you would have seen that there were news reports of revisions down, specifically with women and children, on identified deaths coming apart from the reported deaths. But then you must say, well, okay, so we have a situation where Hamas have embedded themselves in civilian areas. They're using human shields. These are not tactics that are used by other military forces. But what does it look like in other places? And so I think that's probably a better way of addressing the problem, is to say, well, if in Afghanistan you had a 3-1 ratio, and most people thought that was legitimate warfare, and that people weren't being accused of committing a genocide, then that gives you some relative thing for Israel, where you've got some number that's probably below 2-1. I think to come up with an in-principle number probably doesn't work. What you'd like, of course, is that there are no civilian deaths. And I think it's always going to be a context-driven thing. Given the particular facts on the ground, given that particular military strike, was that justifiable? And there's going to be some number where you say, look, there's one Hamas guy who put himself in a nursery school with 1,000 children. It's not okay to drop a bomb on that school. You can't kill 1,000 children to take out the one Hamas guy. There's other methods you can take. You can wait for them to leave. But when you have consistently the case that militants are embedding themselves in schools and hospitals, and they are engaged in active strikes. I mean, in this rescue situation now, I mean, it's not the case that the Israelis just went in there and killed people en masse. They were under fire. You had people with RPGs trying to kill them, and one of those brave rescuers was killed. So you're dealing with a constant combat situation. Of course, on the other side, what's the Hamas ratio? It's kill as many civilians as possible that are Israelis. Let's kill them. We have no problem with killing them. Let's brutalize them. Let's cut out their genitals. Let's remove their their penises and put them in their mouths. Let's burn the bodies. Let's film ourselves doing this. So you have very, very different values of life when it comes to the two different sides.
So I guess there are two elements to this. I mean, one is to say, um, I guess I'm struggling to see how you could provide then a contrastive explanation for why it's 3-1 as opposed to 4-1, other than to say, well, we just have a general seemings, for instance, that the war in Afghanistan was just. I guess what I'm sort of asking is, in virtue of what was the Afghani kill ratio justified, other than to say, well, it seems as though it was justified? Because we could point to as many historical examples as we want, but I want that unifying force that organizes all the discrete elements into a coherent whole to tell us what is the right maker in this particular instance. If we can't provide it, it's difficult to provide a contrastive explanation. It seems like we haven't heard one. So that's the first point. The second point is, and I guess I really want to push here. So imagine we could decrease the kill ratio, okay, by using mustard gas and torture instead, and using the similar kinds of things that you think Hamas, if they had perfect weapons, would use, or at least it seems from your opening statement. Is it your position then, in order to have proportionality and discrimination, that we would be morally justified to use mustard gas and torture in response if it would decrease the kill ratio and end the war?
So I think side constraints are important. And I think that there are certain kinds of behavior that you want off the table. So if you think about the laws of war, part of them deal with proportionality and part of them deal with the kinds of weapons that you can use. So there is value in being able to say that there are certain kinds of weapons that you ought not to use because they're incredibly cruel or because they're indiscriminate. Um, there's reasons to say, even if the introduction of those things would help you in other areas, like you'd save civilian lives, you might still not do it. It's difficult in some sense to have a conversation where there's a legal framework and there's utility in maintaining that legal framework versus coming up with some other kind of, let's say, purely utilitarian framework, where you say, well, look, we can torture this one terrorist to death, and that's going to help, save a bunch of lives. Surely you should be able to do it. And so, any kind of purely consequentialist framework is never going to be able to have any side constraints. Anything can be justified if you get the right numbers at the end. If I think on your first part of your question, one way of thinking about how we develop our intuitions and our principles is through this reflective equilibrium. So you want to be able to say, well, what is our general sense of what is justifiable in war? And obviously, what's complicated about wars is that you have, propaganda efforts on both sides and propaganda efforts often from the winners. So, when someone wins a war, they're going to say all those things that we did were justified. So, the Allies bombed Dresden. They killed lots of civilians in order to terrorize the Germans. That's not really described by many people as a human rights catastrophe. But in retrospect, people might say we're quite uncomfortable with that, or with the nuclear weapons that were used in Japan, or the fire bombings in Tokyo. And so it is important to have side constraints. You want to be able to update your intuitions to current conflicts as well. So, I've tried to refer to conflicts within the last 20 years. I think that gives you a sense of where our intuitions are and what's acceptable and what's not. There might be some ultimate answer in the sky. It might be that there really is some best way you could conduct these things, and that intuitions play no role whatsoever. But unfortunately, you don't really have access to those principles. And I think the way that legal systems work really is this kind of common law approach, where you have facts, you have principles, you mash them together. You make judgments as they come, and then you try and see whether you're within that framework or not.
And Mark, you and I go back a long way, so I apologize for my honesty about this. But I do think the Palestinians have been put in this position where they are somehow portrayed as the bloodthirsty ones. Your emotional appeal to what Hamas did on October 7th, I understand that. But at the same time, I also want to make clear that Israel has a long history of brutality towards the Palestinians and other Arabs. So I encourage you and other people who are listening to this to read the history books, even the ones written by Israeli historians. See, for example, what the Israeli militias did in Deir Yassin, in Dawaima, after a few years. In 1982, when Israel invaded my country, Lebanon, and then they finally entered Beirut, they surrounded the Palestinian refugee camps, and they allowed, by lighting the nights for them, the Falangist militias to slaughter hundreds of Palestinian refugees. And it's always, always the same reason. There are terrorists, there are terrorists, there are terrorists. So yes, I understand Hamas has done horrible things. With being willing to blow up yourself as a suicide bomber is terrible, right? But I also want everybody to look at the Israeli side too. This is a conflict that has dehumanized both people. And the fact that Israel's logic has always been military. I mean, just read the statements of what some. Here's one example. Read some of the accounts of breaking the silence by Israeli soldiers who have served in the West Bank and the horrors that they have recounted about what the Israeli military is willing to do. So there are a number of sources here, and I don't want us to portray the Palestinians as they're the ones who are somehow bloodthirsty, and all of them as a population are like that. We need to quit ourselves of this image.
So my question is for Raja. Gaza has been described as by various people as an open air prison or a concentration camp. But I'm wondering what exactly you think Israel should have done with regard to Gaza. As you know, the Palestinian Authority has turned down the two-state solution twice, in 2000 and 2007. There's been two different intifadas. In October 7th, as you know, there was an attack, the majority of which killed were civilians. And there's been a bloody Lebanese war in 2006. So given that you have this repeated violent approaches and that there does not seem to be an openness to the two-state solution, what exactly was Israel supposed to do with regard to Gaza? I mean, one point that Tim Flack points out is it's not just Israel that's sort of putting a barrier on Gaza. It's Egypt as well. But I'm just curious, do you think that Gaza is an open air prison or a concentration camp? And second, if you think it is and that's wrong, what do you think Israel should have done instead, given this history regarding turning down the two-state solution, Intifada, October 7th, and the Lebanese war? Granted, the Lebanese war is a different country.
So I don't know whether I want to stick to one descriptive concept to describe Gaza. I don't want to call it a concentration camp, because it's going to bring out the wrong reactions in some people. Open air prison is probably more appropriate to describe it, or as Masha Gessen has described it, it's a sort of a ghetto, basically. So I do think that. And the reason why I think that is because of the Israeli blockade. Now, the fact that Egypt has helped doesn't make a difference to me, right? It's just Egypt is as bad in this respect, in this specific respect, as Israel, right? The fact that they're both colluding as far as Gaza is concerned doesn't make it any better. So what should have Israel done? Not blockade Gaza, period, basically. And also initiate good faith negotiations for the two-state solution. Now, part of your question, Steve, was that the Palestinians have rejected the two-state solution. This is not accurate. This is absolutely inaccurate. So in 1993, after the Oslo negotiations began, the Palestinian Authority was willing to start negotiations for a two-state solution. They've undertaken them. As a matter of fact, I would say they were rash in their acceptance of the Oslo Accords because they couldn't see that it was a sort of a trap for them, right? So by the time the Oslo Accords, half of them were implemented, and we had the bypass roads and all of this, the Palestinians woke up to the reality that this is not actually a genuine state. This is a trap for us, basically. So, and then we went into the Camp 2000 negotiations for Camp David, in which Clinton was pressuring Yasser Arafat to accept a deal, and there was a whole hubbub about it, but there's been quite a bit written on it. And the reason why, for example, Arafat, and by the way, Barak was as hesitant to accept the deal as Arafat was, but this is somewhat little known. But there are a number of reasons why Arafat refused it. Now, although it might have been true that this was the most generous offer, as people said later on, it wasn't good enough, basically, because a lot of the permanent status issues, as they have come to be called, were not discussed. And by that point, Arafat has been burnt enough by his experience with Oslo to know not to accept half-baked offers, which is what they were. For example, the Israeli team was never willing to commit to anything official about those things. It was Clinton who was conveying those proposals on behalf of Barak. Barak was hesitating a lot as prime minister at the time. Basically, Barak, he was a little bit afraid of his constituency in Israel. So I wouldn't say the Palestinians have rejected a two-state solution or a Palestinian state. What they have rejected was a proper Palestinian state that gives them proper sovereignty, especially given their experience with Oslo. So I don't want to make it sound as if somehow the Palestinians rejected these things, and so all they want is violence. No, I mean there is detailed, complex history to these offers and reasons why the Palestinians have rejected.
So I'm curious, Mark, if you could address the same question. Do you think that Gaza is an open air prison or a ghetto? And if so, do you think it's justified to have Gaza be an open air prison or a ghetto? And if so, I'm curious as to one, do you think that's an accurate description? And two, if it is, why do you think that's justified?
So I think Gaza could have been a Singapore in the Mediterranean. You've got enormous amounts of international support for the Palestinian cause. You've got enormous amounts of money flowing in. That if the leadership in Gaza took the view that they really did want peace, that money could have been built to build really an incredible place. And if they weren't firing rockets off into Israel, then there would be no need to have a blockade, to have crossings and things like that. You, of course, did have Gazans coming into Israel and working. And as I say, many of those who came over to Israel and were working on those kibbutzes betrayed the left-wing Israelis and participated in killing them. So the question is, what is Gaza going to look like going forward? And I would imagine that it is going to resemble some kind of open-air prison or some kind of ghetto, unless you have an enormous amount of international will to try and bring in a new government that works. I would imagine that would require efforts from a variety of different actors. Some of the surrounding Arab nations like Saudi Arabia, maybe European forces, the Americans, the Israelis. It would be nice for it to become a place of prosperity. Part of the Israeli peace project, something that Shimon Peres sort of thought was important, was that you can have peace through trade, because that's how the Europeans stopped killing each other. If you recall the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War and the World Wars, Europeans have been rather brutal and bloody with each other. And when you set up things like the EU and cross-border trade, you suddenly have a reason not to kill the people that you trade with. And so if you think about the Abraham Accords, that's part of the Israeli project, is to say, well, we have a lot to benefit with each other. That those states that are willing to embrace Israel are going to benefit from it and will benefit from it. And there's no reason why the Palestinians couldn't have been brought into that. So it seems to my mind that there's been a fork in the road for a long time. And unfortunately, the military approach and the terrorist approach has been adopted time and time again by those in the West Bank and those in Gaza, and they don't have to. And there is a sense in which you've had long-standing hostilities with many of the states that surround Israel, and those hostilities have cooled. That Jordan played a role in shooting down those rockets that were coming from Iran. If you think about how some conflicts feel absolutely intractable, like in Ireland, eventually they get resolved. And so I think there is hope that you eventually wind up in a situation where everybody can lead a life of their choosing, and that Gaza doesn't necessarily have to become an open-air prison. It could become a good place, but it's going to require an enormous amount of will from Israelis, from Palestinians, and probably from the global community.
All right, perfect. So with that, we will conclude the open discussion section. This has been incredibly interesting and dynamic and fantastic and amazing and stupendous. And all the wonderful positive adjectives that I could think of. So now we will transition into the closing statement portion of the debate. Raja will start us off. And with that, Raja, you have 5 minutes.
All right, thank you. So I've used the framework of just war theory to defend the idea that Israel's war is unjust. In this closing statement, I'd like to step back from these conditions and assess Israel's war using a bird's eye view of the entire conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Hamas is now, like the PLO in some sense before it, Israel's go-to reason to deflect a permanent settlement of this conflict. Yet both Hamas and the PLO are, in a sense, symptoms of the underlying cause of this conflict, namely the dispossession of an entire people and denying them various moral and political rights, including, most importantly, the right to self-determination on the territory of Palestine that has been their home for centuries. Regardless of the plausibility of Israel's case to Palestine, history shows that Israel's military and political victories have led it to become drunk with power. Couple that with a contemptuous attitude towards the Palestinians that started in the early days of Jewish colonists from Europe, Add to it Israel's desire for the entirety of what it considers to be the land of Israel, and you get a form of intransigence that has perpetuated this conflict beyond any reasonable limits. And regardless of how the Palestinians should have responded in the past, for example, to the partition of 1947, the fact is that they are a people without a land. Actually, they do have a land, but some of them can't live on it because they have been rendered refugees by Israel, and others live on it but either suffer a blockade, as in Gaza, or in the West Bank suffer Israel's oppression through a series of legal and military measures compounded by the atrocious actions of the settlers, who receive ample support from the state. Like any conflict, both sides have committed horrible deeds against each other. Consider the wars between the white colonial settlers and later the United States government on the one hand, and various Native American tribes on the other. Both sides committed massacres against each other, but overall, it was the white settlers who came here and took over the Americans' lands and destroyed their ways of life, regardless of how strong their cause was for religious and other kinds of freedom. Both sides committed atrocities, but the conflict was always asymmetrical, both morally and in terms of power. A similar thing happened with and to the Palestinians. Despite all this, the Palestinians have given major concessions. The PLO started first in 1946 with a rejection of Israel and accepted a secular state, including Jews who were in Palestine, up until 1917. It then changed its position in 1968. It continued to advocate for a secular state, but now it included Israeli Jews up to the time of this latest change, 1968. Then it conceded again and accepted a two-state solution on those territories that remained after the armistice agreements of 1949. Then, from 1993 to 2000, it agreed in principle on further land swaps so that Israel can retain the major settlement blocks. Israel's refusal to budge on other issues, the refugees, the status of Jerusalem, and overall security, to give three examples, has stymied any real deal. Simply put, it seems that Israel does not really want to give up Jerusalem or the West Bank. The fact that it has maintained an active settlement program since 1967, when it took over the West Bank and Jerusalem, and the fact that it has officially annexed East Jerusalem are proof enough of this. The burden now, I think, is on Israel. It needs to offer the Palestinians a solution that preserves their dignity, equality, and freedom, and that satisfies their basic rights. This can minimally be done by allowing them to have a state on parts of their historic lands, or better yet, declare a democratic state for both people and be done with it. This, incidentally, allows Israel to act morally not only with respect to the Palestinians, but if I may speak on behalf of my Semitic cousins, the Jews, but also with respect to Jews around the world, in whose name Israel purports to speak, and because of which it has placed them in many difficult positions. Just witness the number of Jews today around the world who are protesting against Israel's actions and who are basically declaring, not in my name. And also, Israel can do so with respect to the Israeli people themselves, whose way of life and culture has come to be its own thing, not necessarily connected to other Jewish cultures around the world. It would allow the Israelis, whether they are Jewish or Palestinian, to be their own people. In doing all this, I think Israel would finally begin to merit the description of being the light unto the nations. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you for your closing statement, Raja. We'll now turn to Mark for his closing statement.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the audience for the wonderful questions that came through, and I want to thank Raja for participation in this. Raja and I have known each other for many years. He's been on Brain Nevat as a guest on numerous occasions, and when I've been on holiday, he's co-hosted the show. I think this is a very, very difficult topic. It's an incredibly emotional topic. It requires an enormous amount of understanding of history, of legal principles, of moral principles, and it's very hard to do justice to it in an hour and a half. But the one thing that I'm incredibly happy about is that we've managed to have this discussion in a way that's incredibly civil. And I think part of why these discussions are important is to model civility. Then I think both Raja and I probably have some common interests at stake, that it would be good to be able to come up with solutions to resolve this conflict that has been intractable for so long. That it would be good for all people who live in the region to be able to lead lives that are flourishing, for the violence to end, to come up with innovative ways of ensuring that that happens. And so I think that's something worth celebrating in of its own. I know that at the moment, Israelis find themselves in a situation of enormous trauma, that we think about this as happening to other people, out there. For Israelis, they think of it as happening to their brothers and their sisters, that everybody knows someone who's been affected by it, that wherever you walk in Israel, you see pictures of hostages, that the enormous celebration that collectively was felt when hostages were released shows that there is a real strong resolve to protect innocent civilians, who were taken. And I think there's a strong feeling that it would be good for the conflict to end, for those civilians to come back home. Everywhere you go in Israel, you see "Bring them home" signs around people's necks, in their shop windows, on cars. That is hugely important. But also what's important is, of course, to ensure that this never happens again. Never again is something that Jews have had to say for a very long time. That it's the resounding call after the Holocaust, but Jews have suffered persecution, for hundreds of years, and have always been in a situation where they've had to flee for their lives. They were accused of being sinister because they were stateless. Now they're accused of being too powerful because they have a state. That they're always put in a situation where they're unwelcome, where they can make no correct moves, where they're vilified by many corners. And it creates a difficult environment that I really do think Israelis find themselves in an existential crisis. And I think Jews around the world feel that things have heated up, that it's hard to be a Jew on an American campus. I think we shouldn't overestimate the number of Jews who are protesting the war. That I think often it's a few vocal minorities. That often in Iran you have ultra-Orthodox Jews paraded around who don't believe in a state of Israel. So, see, these guys don't think that Israel should exist either. And so you have a couple of people dressed up to look like they're representative of the entire Haredi community, when in fact it's a very small number. That you can always find someone who's going to denounce their alleged brethren. I think what you want to try and do is get a sense of a pulse of what the average person thinks. And I think one sort of strange way of thinking about this is, if you look at the Eurovision contest, when average people had to vote for which song they liked, they overwhelmingly supported the Israeli song. Not because I think they like Israeli music very much, but I think because they feel an affinity with the Israeli people. Elites, on the other hand, downvoted the song. And so I think what you have is a situation where people in newsrooms, people on college campuses have taken quite a hostile stance in Israel, whereas I think many people can imagine themselves being put in such a situation and side with the Israeli cause, would like peace, would like an end to the bloodshed, don't like seeing bloodshed on either side, but want some kind of just resolution. And I'm sure Raja and I both would like that. And Nathan and Steve, I want to say thank you so much for hosting a really vibrant debate. You've both done a wonderful job of keeping it entertaining, pushing it forward at a good rate, and allowing us to discuss a really difficult topic in a clear way.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you, Mark, too.
All right, perfect. Yeah, and with that, we have the conclusion of the debate between Mark and Raja on the motion, "This House believes that Israel's war is unjust." Which side prevailed? I guess you guys could discuss that in the comments, but most importantly, it's good that we could have these discussions in a civil way between two people where we could produce more light than heat. And it's good to do these things because Lord knows we need more civil conversations. So yeah, thank you very much.
And I also want to add to it, just a fantastic debate. I mean, both debaters did superb, incredibly illuminating, and it's just a real honor and a pleasure to host both of you. Two superb intellectuals. Thank you.